After 2 years of an unprecedented surge of anti-Semitism in the United States, as well as around the globe, the pertinent question to ask is not so much who is going to come to the defense of the Jews, but rather whether the Jews are capable of defending themselves. When it comes to the half of world Jewry that lives in the state of Israel, the answer is an unequivocal yes. When it comes to Jews living elsewhere, especially in the United States, the answer is clearly no, as the largely passive Jewish response to the intimidation and even violence visited upon Jews on college campuses since October 7, 2023 has demonstrated. Can American Jews shake off their defensive posture, rooted in fear and a distorted conception of Jewish values, to begin acting to both deter those who attack them and to convince them that the Jews are not easy prey for thugs? Today, on Think Twice, we examine the question of whether Jews can learn to fight back with the author of a new book on the subject. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an interesting conversation for you with Benjamin Kerstein, the author of an important new book about Jewish self-defense. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, to today's program. There's no doubt that over the last 2 years, we've witnessed an unprecedented surge in anti-Semitism in the United States. But the responses to it from Jews have done little but to confirm that not only are Jews unprepared for the job of defending themselves, but that they simply don't think in such terms. The usual response to the campaign of hate and delegitimization and intimidation of Jews, whether on college campuses or elsewhere, has been to shelter in place and to appeal to the authorities for help rather than to organize to stand up against the anti-Semitic mobs, whether violently or non-violently. Part of the reason is that American Jews long thought of themselves essentially secure and accepted in a way that no other community in the history of the diaspora ever has been. In spite of the persistence of Jew hatred, that was largely true. The strategies adopted by Jewish community in terms of making alliances and helping to promote tolerance as well as Holocaust education seemed to work, or at least they did until they didn't. Moreover, past attempts to organize U.S. Jews to defend themselves, principally Rabbi Meir Kahana's Jewish Defense League in the 1960s and 70s, had been a fiasco which had collapsed amid illegality and violence that discredited the whole idea of Jewish self-defense. But after the reaction to October 7th, in which anti-Semitism has been normalized and mainstreamed in a way that shocked and appalled Jews unused to thinking of their lives being disrupted by Jew hatred, perhaps it's time to rethink self-defense, if not the ideas and the methods of the JDL. Moreover, the ability of anti-Semites to mobilize and intimidate Jews on college campuses and even outside of academia, such as what we saw last week at the Park East Synagogue in Manhattan, an event whose animating idea was endorsed by the city's mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani, ought to be yet a wake-up call for Jews to understand that it's time to start thinking about self-defense. One person who has thought a lot about the subject is Benjamin Kerstein, the author of a new book about the subject, and we're pleased to have him with us today. Benjamin Kerstein is an associate fellow of the Z3 Institute, a columnist for the Allgemeiner, and writes the No Delusions, No Despair Substack. In the past, he's been an editor at JNS, Azure, and The Tower, and he's the author of the new book, Self-Defense, A Jewish Manifesto. Benjamin Kerstein, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be here and see you again.
Well, Benji, thanks so much for coming on the show. I want to start by asking about how you came to write this book. Clearly, it's a response to October 7th and what followed. But while there have already been a lot of books about October 7th, as well as a robust conversation about anti-Semitism, outside of Israel, there hasn't been much talk about Jews defending themselves, has there?
Well, there's more and more at the moment, but initially, no, there was not. I actually kind of had the book in my head for quite a while because I've been aware of the rise of anti-Semitism for about 20 years. I really think what we're dealing with here is the end game, or at least a consummation of what started during the Second Intifada that began in 2000. And I've been advocating for some kind of Jewish self-defense ever since then. Excuse me. And what happened was after October 7th, when the violence began and the hate rallies began, and it became very clear that there was a coordinated and concerted attack on American Jews underway, some people came to me and said, well, maybe it's time for you to write this book. So I did. And thankfully, it's been somewhat of a success. And I hope it's having a little bit of effect on the conversation.
One of the points you make in the book is that for 2 millennia, Jews have regarded self-defense as either impossible or undesirable and have adopted a position of what you call learned helplessness. What do you mean by that?
Well, learned helplessness is a psychological concept that came about in the 1970s. And through some rather cruel animal experiments that probably couldn't be done today, they discovered that when they put a dog in a cage and gave it electric shocks where it couldn't escape, and then put it in a cage with the door open when it could escape and gave it electric shocks, it didn't escape. It just kind of sat there and took it. And the theory was that it had learned that there was no point in trying to escape. And the name that they gave to this was learned helplessness. And I felt that the Jews, for many, many centuries, had been in a situation where, in many cases, they simply couldn't escape anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence. And over time, they learned that there was basically no point in trying, and that the Jews simply had to endure what was done to them. Now, obviously, Zionism was a reaction to that. It was the Jews who basically said, no, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to do something about it. But I think that in the United States, in which Zionism certainly has had an effect, but which has also had other strains of diaspora Judaism that have never transcended learned helplessness is still a very great problem. And that my belief now is that American Jews need to overcome that in the same way that the early Zionists did, and to realize that they can do something. They can do something that is legal and moral, but is nonetheless a form of self-defense, and that they don't have to sit there and take the shocks anymore.
At the heart of the argument that you make in the book is a question not so much how American Jews can defend themselves, but a belief, I think, that the Jewish community simply doesn't think in terms of self-defense. And part of that is, as you discussed, learned helplessness, but also because they believe that American exceptionalism is ultimately their best defense, their best protector. While that exceptionalism is definitely under attack, certainly by the entire, woke progressive movement, it's by no means, a lost cause. It's not exactly completely disappeared. America is still very different from any other country. And, I think some of the pushback against the woke movement, shows that. So even after the last 2 years, a lot of Jews still think that organizing for their defense in the way that you recommend can't work, or at least isn't entirely necessary. Why are they wrong?
Well, they're wrong because I simply don't believe in this idea that it can't happen here. It can happen anywhere. And I lived in Israel for 20 years. I spoke with people who were survivors. I spoke with people who had undergone horrific persecution, and not just Holocaust survivors, but people who had escaped the Soviet Union, people who had escaped genocide in Ethiopia, people who had come from everywhere in the world. And the idea, I think, that America is so exceptional that it couldn't happen here is simply an illusion, or at the very least, let's say, the entirety of Jewish history runs against it. The entirety of Jewish history tells us that it can happen anywhere. Now, will the United States ultimately pull out of this when we see anti-Semitism in a kind of pincer movement coming mostly from the left, but also increasing anti-Semitic voices on the right? I think that's an open question, and I certainly don't think the Jews should sit around to find out. I think they should rise in their own self-defense. I don't think that they should flee. I don't think Aliyah, at least at the moment, is the only answer. But I do think that they should realize that they need to fight to remain both Jews and to remain Americans. And I see this as the only viable response, because if they don't fight, I do think America will end up being like everywhere else. And we may face not a Holocaust. I don't think that's in the offing. But something like the expulsion from Spain, where one of the greatest diaspora communities in history comes to a very sudden and precipitous end. And I think everything should be done to avoid that.
Well, obviously, no one should take anything for granted. I think you're right that, to assume that it could not possibly happen, anything, you're right. There's no such, as we say in journalism, we never use the word never. So that's certainly true. And I think certainly bolstering your argument is, as much as the left is in some ways a bigger problem in terms of anti-Semitism, and something you concentrate on in your book, the recent push from the right, the Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, and others who use this term Israel firsters to describe Jews who won't disavow Israel, that really speaks to the idea of people trying to single out Jews and make them give up their identity in a way that is really, number one, it's almost unprecedented, really, in American history. But I think bolsters your argument, perhaps even in some ways, even more than the hostility from the left.
Yeah, I mean, I found the Tucker Carlson interview with Fuentes and the reaction to it in some corners on the right. I mean, Candace Owens and other people like that.
Yeah, but even the head of the Heritage Foundation. Yeah, I mean,
it's true.
Candace Owens says, when mainstream conservatives, wink at it or say nothing to see or move on, that's something very scary.
Yeah, and that disturbed me very deeply because I knew there was anti-Semitism on the right. And I've written about it in the past. But over the past 2 years, it seemed to me that it was the left that was overwhelmingly the greater threat. And, it was the left that was in the streets besieging Jews. It was the left that was attacking Jews. It was the left that was murdering both Jews and non-Jews. And it just seemed to me that this was overwhelmingly the existential danger, if you like, to American Jewry. The rise of anti-Semitism on the right doesn't strike me still as being a threat of that magnitude. But what it threatens, if you will, if I can, repeat myself, is that it could, in which case the American Jews are in a pincer movement.
Yeah.
And there's really nowhere to go. Except
it does sort of take the ground out for me, those who would say, there's only one threat. And that really is unbalancing, certainly, to American Jewry. Now, isn't a big part of the problem in dealing with anti-Semitic violence the fact that many Jews don't fully understand what they're up against? In response to hate, Jews have traditionally sought to make alliances with other minorities, promote Holocaust education, and to use the resources provided by a democracy to isolate the haters. Why doesn't that work anymore, if it ever really completely did?
That's a huge question. I think there's several factors at work. One of them is, the rise of intense political polarization, which is that essentially American liberalism, which on both left and right define the political discourse, for decades and decades, is basically gone. And what you have now is intensely polarized forces on the left and the right. And as a result, I think you have more and more extremism. And extremists almost inevitably eventually get to the protocols of the elders of Zion. That's sort of where they end. That's the end of this kind of terrible logic they have. So that you see both sides blaming the Jews is not necessarily a massive surprise. It's a surprise in America, but it's happened over and over again in other countries. The most famous example being Weimar Germany, which is a metaphor I am very reticent to use, but, it has to be said. And I think that another problem is there's an inherent flaw in democracy that people don't like to talk about, which is, although democracy can be very diverse and very good for minorities and give them a voice they wouldn't have in a more authoritarian structure, it can also fall to the madness of crowds. It can fall to populism and other it's very vulnerable
well,
to
the founders of the United States were very wary of democracy.
Yeah.
What they wanted was a constitutional republic, not
Exactly.
a democracy.
For that reason. And I think that, my father, for example, has often said, Jews do very well in democracy. And my thought has always been, well, Weimar Germany was a democracy, so it's like, what if the majority votes to expel the Jews? I mean, what do we do then? And I think that this is one of the reasons why I think the fight against anti-Semitism is also a fight for America, because modern societies, and this has been proven, I think, by history, cannot survive anti-Semitism. And if anti-Semitism seizes the commanding heights of the Republic, that's the end of the Republic. I don't see how the Republic survives that. So to my mind, obviously our first priority should be defend the Jewish community, but it's a fight for the United States as well.
Yeah. Now, a big part of this problem is that anti-Semitism is not coming at the Jews in the way the Jewish organizations expected. That Jewish organizations which were built to defend Jews just only against one kind of threat, which is against the far right, against neo-Nazis. They failed to cope with the threat of left-wing anti-Semitism. In your opinion, was this just a matter of politics, or is there something else in play?
Well, this is where I get into my class analysis, which some people are uncomfortable with, but I always note that the early Zionists were very, very conscious of this. I think that unfortunately, people are largely in denial that the Jewish community has a class system, but of course it does. I mean, all communities do. And I think that the mainstream organizations of the Jewish community are largely populated by the Jewish upper class. And the Jewish upper class has always been very, very wary of Zionism. It's been very, very wary of making trouble. It's been very, very wary of being too outspoken, too quote unquote extreme. And it has always wanted to work within existing institutions. And I think that the establishment Jewish organizations in the United States simply didn't know what to do when those institutions turned against them. And they didn't know what to do when their paradigm was completely shattered, when these alliances they had made with other minorities, literally on October 8th, 2023, were completely blown to pieces, where all of these so-called allies basically said, no, we're really on the side of the rapists and the murderers. We're on the side of Hamas and the Palestinians. So goodbye. Thank you for all your money and support, but, we're out of here. Which is a classic thing. I mean, this is a classic thing that non-Jewish societies have done throughout history. They take our stuff and then they spit in our faces. But I think the American Jewish establishment and its elite was simply totally unprepared to deal with that. And it was like a punch in the face, and it just knocked them clean out. And I still don't think they've recovered. I still don't think they've woken up. And to the extent they have, they really don't know what to do about it. And so this to me is a disgraceful failure. I mean, and I'll stop there because I'm just going to get angry about it.
Well, you can say what you want. I mean, obviously, as you know, I've been very critical of the Jewish establishment and of organizations like the ADL for years and years. I will give the ADL some credit in that, as much as I don't think they fully grasp the extent of the problem, but it's not as if they have been quiet. They have, they've responded to some extent. They realized, I think, that going woke didn't save the Jews. It didn't work for them, all of their allies on the left that they were so worried about alienating and staying in sync with, to the extent that they were endorsing anti-Semitic groups like, the Black Lives Matter organization and, the whole embracing, woke progressive ideas in their own education programs, which frankly enabled anti-Semitism. I think since October 7th, they've been backing away from it. And the ADL is, now up in arms about, Zoran Mamdani, as they should be. But, I think, from reading your book, it's like there's more to it than that. They have to understand what's at play here in a way that, doesn't, they don't seem to get that the whole, woke catechism of DEI and the rest of it is enabling anti-Semitism, when at heart they really like they'll go back to supporting it. It's just they don't want people to be mean to the Jews. Except that it's inevitable that they will be if that's what they believe.
Well, I think the main problem is just that the ADL and other similar groups are terrified of making what the late Congressman and civil rights leader John Lewis called good trouble, which he referred to as trouble that upends an unjust order, basically. And he said once, make good trouble and redeem the soul of America. And I think that, as I was saying earlier, I mean, these groups are terrified of making trouble, and they've assimilated this idea of, it will only, quote unquote, make things worse. Well, I don't think it's going to make things worse. I think it could make things better. And what I hear from ordinary Jews, and a lot of them have contacted me since they've read my book and some of my other articles on this subject, is where are these people? Where is the ADL? Where are these so-called defense groups? We don't feel that they're there for us. We don't feel that they're there on the street. We don't feel that they're there protecting us when our synagogues are besieged by anti-Semites, like just happened a couple of days ago in New York. They do not feel protected, and they do not feel defended. Now, the ADL may be doing some good things, and I don't love criticizing other Jewish organizations at a time like this, but if American Jews don't feel it, well, that means something. And that means that is a massive failure, because the ADL and groups like it have one job, which is to protect the American Jewish community. In the end, they have one job. And if American Jews don't feel protected, and they aren't protected, as they weren't at the Park East Synagogue, that to me says everything. That means that these organizations' failure is manifest. Now, I would prefer that they change. I would prefer that they adjust their policies accordingly and take a more militant stance. And I'm not talking about violence, by the way, when I say militant, but take a stronger stance, a more aggressive stance, that they make trouble. Whether that can be done without actually replacing the leadership, I'm not sure, but they have a chance here to redeem themselves, and I hope they do.
Yeah, well, I agree with you about that, and I've written as much. But it's very hard for them. Now, when you speak of, the class system within the Jewish world, I mean, sure. I mean, Jewish organizations are dominated by the donors, but, these are self-selecting leaguers. It's not as if Jewish organizations can tax ordinary Jews and can count on their support. It's all voluntary. Yeah, it's all voluntary. And, the Jews who do step up and try to do something, I'm not going to criticize them. They all are doing whatever they think is most important. Everybody is in business for themselves in the Jewish world. The ADL, however, is one of the rare Jewish organizations founded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that actually still does have a job. Many of the Jewish organizations founded, at that time no longer do. They're largely obsolescent. The ADL still has a job. The question is it going to do it? And I think in recent years it wasn't doing it at all. Let's hope it sort of is on the way back to that. But you're right. They need a good push. Now, let me drill down a little bit about what you said about, making good trouble, quoting John Lewis. But you've also said something, and really something you also said just a few minutes early. You believe that Jews mustn't just be concerned about the threats against them, but to get angry about it and to embrace that anger. Now, a lot of Jews, especially Jewish leaders, the Jewish establishment, would say that's neither healthy nor productive. But you do link this to the need to make good trouble. Explain why we need to be angry in a way that you sense that a lot of the people in the Jewish world are not, or at least are not expressing it in a productive way.
Well, I think ordinary Jews are angry. Whether the establishment is angry, I couldn't say. I'm not a macher. I'm not far up in that world. But I think we need to get angry because we have a perfect right to be angry. Look at what we've been subjected to over the past 2 years. I mean, unrelenting defamation, unrelenting incitement, unrelenting harassment, unrelenting violence, and indeed, I must emphasize again, several murders of both Jews and non-Jews related to this anti-Semitic movement that has emerged since October 8th, 2023. Now, it seems to me that Jews are generally afraid of anger, partially that is because of the learned helplessness issue, because for centuries Jews felt that anger wasn't going to get them anywhere and there's no point in it. And they sort of adapted this idea that by not getting angry, they were in some way morally superior to non-Jews because they didn't do these things. They didn't go out and commit pogroms. They didn't go out and, kill people because of their religion. And they were right to think that, by the way. I mean, they were morally superior in that sense. And I'm certainly not suggesting they should do anything like that now. But anger is also a human emotion. It's perfectly healthy when it's justified. And to reject anger completely is like rejecting love or sadness or any other human emotion. And I think anger is also a great spur towards action. Now, you have to be careful with it. It's explosive material. It can get you in a lot of bad trouble. But you can't make good trouble without anger. And don't think, by the way, that people like Lewis or Martin Luther King or people who embrace nonviolence or people who embrace violence only in self-defense were not angry. They were very angry, and they were extremists in a certain sense. Martin Luther King called himself an extremist for Jesus.
And they were criticized for expressing that anger.
Yes. I mean, King was very controversial when he first started out. Today he's a secular saint, but back then he was seen as very radical. So, and I think American Jews, if they want to make a real fight, are going to have to accept their anger and to say, being angry does not make us morally inferior. It doesn't make us like our enemies. It doesn't make us like, I don't like the analogy, but it doesn't make us like the Nazis. Yes, the Nazis were angry. Yes, they hated people. The people who fought the Nazis were angry and hated the Nazis. I mean, this is not, the problem with Nazism was not that they were angry. And I think that American Jews need to realize that their anger is justified and it's also essential if they want to preserve their community.
But doing that's going to involve kind of a culture change, a shift. Because the entire, you could blame it on the Jewish establishment and Jewish organizations. You and I both have done that at times. But in effect, those organizations are responding and have long responded to what, most of the people that give them money and a broad base of, frankly, of liberal Jewry that supports them, that thinks that, that you shouldn't make trouble, that that like these groups the way they are. How do, it requires more than just pointing to the news. This requires kind of a change in thinking on the part of American Jewry, even after what we've witnessed in the last 2 years, doesn't it?
Well, it reminds me of something George Orwell said during World War II, where he was saying that due to the war, English society had to change, in his view, in a more socialist direction. Now, you can agree or disagree with that. It's not relevant. But he said that England was now trapped between the grasping and the unteachable, between the living and the dead. And I think that's true of the American Jewish community right now. Again, this is just what I've heard from ordinary Jews. Maybe they're a self-selecting group, but I don't really think so, because I've heard it from Jews who are not very Zionist and are not very people who would normally feel this way. They feel lost. They don't know what to do. They know something's wrong. This is particularly young Jews I hear this from, who are just out of college or are still in college and things like this and see all this stuff going on. My own sister, who has never had a particularly strong Jewish identity, says this to me. She knows something's wrong. She knows there's a threat. She and many others don't really know what to do about it. And I think the key now is to give them something to grasp on, because they want to be among the living. They're not unteachable. They don't want to be among the dead. But we are going to require, and I hate to use the word, a kind of re-education, because American Jews have been miseducated for many, many decades. And I do think that there is going to be an element of teaching involved here, where we're going to have to raise their consciousness. Again, sorry for using the term, but that is what it is. We're going to have to raise the Jewish consciousness and to a certain extent radicalize American Jews. That's a big task, but I think an enormous number are ready for it and are looking for some answers. And, if they don't get some answers, I think we should realize what the dangers are, because it could lead to A, total assimilation, or B, and maybe these two simultaneously, B, something really, really ugly. Like a resurrection of a kind of JDL-like organization, which I completely reject in my
we'll
book.
We'll get into the JDL in a moment,
right.
a little bit later, because I do want to ask specifically about that. But let me follow up on this by, do you think part of the problem, or at least a big part of the problem, is that a critical mass of American Jewry is basically Jewishly illiterate, doesn't have a strong sense of Jewish peoplehood, let alone faith or anything that would give them the inner strength to push back and to want to defend themselves or, really understand what's at stake. And that there is clearly a minority. It's a fairly small minority, but not an entirely insignificant minority that is taking the side of the anti-Semites. Zoran Mamdani got reportedly 30% of the Jewish vote in New York City, a man who is an open anti-Semite. And there are lots of ways you can explain that, because Jews just vote for Democrats, and because the propaganda against Israel in the last 2 years. But part of this is just a community that has no sense of itself, or at least a large part of the community that has no sense of itself, is really defenseless when attacked, and doesn't know what they're defending.
Yeah, well, I think that's what I was just talking about, is that one of the things we need to give these American Jews who are grasping is a sense of that identity and a sense of themselves. And that does involve, part of that education involves Jewish history, it involves Jewish thought, it involves the history of Zionism, which I think is significant, not just because I agree with it, but which is the only indigenous Jewish political movement of the past century. It involves telling them, just simply telling them, you don't have to put up with this. You don't have to feel this way. You don't have to feel guilty. You don't have to feel responsible for these, libelous claims about genocide and famine and all this other stuff. You don't have to collaborate with people who hate you. And you can explain the proof that these people hate you, and the proof is that they demand that you forego your Jewish identity. And that you join the other side against your own people. And I think that is part of the re-education that needs to be undertaken. The other thing is that I think a lot of Jews, though, that I've encountered want that kind of education. They're looking for a sense of self. And I mean, one of the great themes repeated over and over again about today's American society, and maybe globalized societies in general, is the loss of a sense of self. The sense of atomization, a sense of not knowing who you are and where you come from. Well, the Jews do know who they are and where they come from. It's just a lot of them have forgotten it. And if you can tell them that, I think a lot of them will embrace it, because they want this as much as any other atomized individual in this globalized world. And I think that is absolutely essential. Jewish identity, and I don't like to use the word pride, but because it sounds slightly chauvinistic, but I think self-respect, to say you can be a self-respecting person just like anybody else. Why should that be denied to you because you happen to be a Jew, and because these people are identifying you with Israel and Zionism and all these other supposedly evil things? Why do you have to sacrifice yourself on the altar of this demented God just to please these people?
Yeah, well, I think in your book you do talk about the need to embrace, sort of the glory of it, Tiferet Israel.
Tiferet Israel, yeah. Which is an untranslatable word, but yeah, glory of Israel is sort of...
Well, we can try to translate it.
Yeah, it's close, but...
Yeah, and that, you have to feel that. You have to feel that you're part of something bigger than yourself. And, once you do, you can then you could read Jabotinsky, and with whom you quote extensively, and understand, that there are real answers there.
Yeah, and Herzl and
the rest of the Zionist canon, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, let's drill down for, a bit on what to do. First, let me say, there is a Jewish agency that does deal with the defense of the Jews, the Secure Community Network, which is in charge of protecting Jewish institutions, whose head has been on this program, and which is, I'd add, a pretty impressive outfit. But while you don't dismiss it, you think the problem is the whole idea of thinking defensively and focusing on security at the point of the attack, as you put it, which is what they do. And, thinking beyond that is what is important. I think, so what is your critique of the focus on just sort of defending, Jewish buildings, which is where a lot of money and a lot of, and a lot of good work has been put into?
I wouldn't call it a critique, because I do think that kind of stuff is essential, and I don't want to knock the people who are doing it, and God bless them, and Zavodah Kedusha, it's holy work, I just don't think it's enough.
Right.
And because I think that if you concentrate solely on security at point of attack, and we see this, by the way, in Europe, and we absolutely see this, what that leads to in the end, I think, is ghettoization. It marginalizes the Jews from society, which is one of the things the anti-Semites want to do, and that people like Mamdani want to do. They want to completely marginalize American Jews, disempower them completely, and basically put them in a de facto ghetto, maybe a kind of ghetto of the mind, but a ghetto nonetheless. And I think what's required is to break the walls of that ghetto. You need an organization that is more aggressive, that is more proactive, that is more outward looking in its concept of defense. And as people say, the best defense is a good offense. I think that that kind of defense should be done legally. I think it should be done in accordance with Jewish morality. I think it can be done in both those senses. But nonetheless, I think point of attack security is essential, but it's not enough. And, Israel demonstrates that. I mean, the Israeli military concentrates on security services. They concentrate on security point of attack, but certainly not just that. And I'm not suggesting that, American Jews should get F-15s and go bomb something, but the concept, I think, is essential. But the real fight there is against ghettoization, because, and I've met, in Israel, I met tons of Jews from France, tons of Jews from Britain, South Africa, places like that. And they all say, more or less, usually without using the word, but what they describe is, we live in a ghetto. We can't, we can't really leave our communities. We have to be careful what neighborhoods we go through. We have to be careful what we say in public. We have to conceal Jewish symbols, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you see that beginning to happen in the United States, and I don't think it should be allowed to continue.
Yeah. Now, in discussing how Jews should respond to the current crisis, you cite in your book what you call the Battle of UCLA as a model, at least in part, of how Jews should act. Tell us about that, what went right and what went wrong at UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles, where there was, a confrontation between, the encampments, the pro-Hamas mob and some Jews. Why should we understand that? Why is this important?
We should understand it for the simple reason that it worked, which is that a bunch of Jews went in, they confronted the people who, I like to use the term, conquered and colonized that university, illegally, by the way. And as a result, the university cleaned out the encampment, I think, within 48 hours. So it worked. They liberated the Jews on that campus from the oppression that they were suffering. Now, what went wrong was that they did so in some ways illegally. There were assaults and there were other acts of violence that I think were in the end counterproductive. What got the university to move was the confrontation itself, the act of confronting. And I think had that confrontation been done non-violently, or only if violence was used, only in a legal type of self-defense.
Only in self-defense.
Right, only in self-defense. It could have been even more effective because it might have been imitated on many other campuses.
Right.
And I think we could have seen, 2, 3, many UCLAs, which to me would have been wonderful, because it would have been the Jews taking their destiny into their own hands, and it would have seriously impeded the kind of anti-Semitism that we were seeing at that time, in which Jews were simply being placed under essentially an apartheid system on American campuses. Now, those Jews who fought the Battle of UCLA succeeded in what they were trying to do. They should have done it differently in some ways, but you cannot argue with success. And I think that with some adjustments, that should be one of the models that American Jews use to defend themselves.
When we discuss this, we also have to understand how completely against the grain the response of those kids at UCLA was to the entire culture of American Jewry, because pretty much everywhere else at places like Columbia, the response to the pro-Hamas mobs was to tell the students to shelter in place. Don't go to school. Go home or stay in your dorm rooms. Don't make any trouble. Don't even go to the encampments and try to talk to the people. Don't argue with them. Just shah still. Be quiet, because we can't, because the idea of confrontation was just beyond the ken of, I think, the students who, were sent to, their parents didn't send them to school to get into trouble. I come from a generation, a little bit older than you, during the time of the Soviet Jewry movement, and not just at the end where everybody was for it, but sometimes at the beginning where not too many people were for it. Where, it was kind of considered a given that, kids at college would sometimes, engage in demonstrations and get into, speak up. That's not what most American Jewish parents want for their kids now, or even considering. And certainly the leaders, the people that are sort of ministering to these students, the heads of the Hillels, they were the ones telling them to shelter in place. It's like what happened to UCLA was like completely out of the blue, and it's not surprising it was the only place it happened, because most Jews just don't think in those terms.
Yes, but the fact that it happened proves that it's there. And it reminds me of something Haram said, where he said, the urge towards self-preservation neither sleeps nor slumbers in the heart of our people. So it's there. What needs to be done is to organize it, to use it constructively, to use it legally and morally, and to attempt to reproduce it in a better way. Now, what you were saying about Jewish parents and so forth, this to me relates to an illusion that American Jews are sadly suffering from, and that Jews in other countries have suffered from in the past, which is the illusion that they can be middle class. And part of today in America, the idea is that the ticket to a middle class life, and hopefully an upper middle class life, is a degree from a quote unquote good school. And I think that American Jewish parents in particular are still trapped in that paradigm. What they don't realize is that the Jews can never be middle class, because the middle class can always decide that they're Jews. And that all that status and all of that accumulated wealth that they've worked for so hard can be taken from them in a second. Things can change like that. And I think that that paradigm needs to change. And I think this is something I write about in my book, American Jewish parents need to say to their kids, if you're faced with this kind of thing and you decide to fight, we will back you up 1,000%. We'll be proud of you. We'll defend you. If you get arrested, we'll bail you out with him, within a couple of hours. And we will, help you with whatever legal troubles you have. We want you to be able to stand up and defend yourselves. And I think the larger community should embrace that as well. I think they should say, make sure you're provoked. Don't try not to commit any crimes, but if you're being harassed or if you're in danger, stand up for yourself, and we're right behind you. I think that would go an enormous way towards encouraging further UCLAs or even better kinds of UCLAs.
In a better Jewish community. I totally agree with you. Although, let's just, let's be honest here. If there is any demographic in the United States that is thoroughly, ensconced in the credentialed elites, which, is a big part of how American politics breaks down. I mean, the reason why, the big divide in American politics is these days between the credentialed elites and the working class that played out in the 24 election. Now, if there's any demographic that speaks to the credentialed elites, it's the Jews. That we're not a working class, for the most part, we're not a working class community. So, sending kids to schools and getting those degrees, that is at the heart of the culture of, most American Jews right now.
But look what's happening right now to the Jews in the credentialed elite. They're being pushed out. They're being marginalized. Their numbers are diminishing in colleges, even without the issue of anti-Semitism for various reasons. Affirmative action, DEI policies, things like that have pushed the Jews out. They're being pushed out of politics, particularly in the Democratic Party.
Right.
They're being marginalized in social situations. They're being marginalized in the art world. They're being forced to conceal Jewish symbols. I come from a lower middle class family. My father owns a small business, but his business has been vandalized several times because he sells Israeli products. The process of marginalization is underway. And I think that middle-class American Jews, again, need to realize that they're not middle class because this can be taken from them at any moment. Maybe it'll happen slowly, like, the frog being boiled and doesn't realize it's being boiled, or something along those lines. I think Mamdani is going to act like that. He's going to use salami tactics to basically push the Jews out.
I think that's already started, clearly.
Yeah. But I think that, again, requires a certain amount of re-education or perhaps a realization. The Jews are all in it together. And, the Jewish elite may think itself superior to other factions of the Jewish community. But they're wrong. And they have to realize they're wrong. We're all in the same boat, whether we like it or not.
Right.
Because to our enemies, we're all in the same boat. Our enemies don't care.
Yeah.
They don't care if it's someone who heads a major organization or my father who owns a small business, operating on a very small profit margin, who has to deal with this kind of stuff. Our enemies don't care.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't either.
Now, when American Jews speak of self-defense, invariably the discussion has to turn, as we alluded to before, to the Jewish Defense League and its leader, Rabbi Meir Kahane. Why did the JDL not only fail, and it did fail, but turn out to be a fiasco for the entire concept of self-defense, which we're still sort of, still resonates in our debates today?
The minor reason is simply Kahane and his personality, that he so dominated that movement, that his extremism led to that movement falling into taking a path that was self-destructive. The major reason is that path, which is that the JDL embraced illegality and immorality. It did things that were against the law, and it did some horrible things that were against the law, including killing people in terrorist attacks. And not only was that appalling on a moral level, but on a tactical level, it was an unmitigated disaster. What it did was it gave the sword to anti-Semites and to other people who did not have the Jewish community's best interests in mind. It gave them the sword they needed to destroy that organization. And now it's been completely wiped out. There's basically nothing left of it. And that was done because they had legitimately committed some terrible crimes. And the FBI and other law enforcement agencies
as a terrorist organization.
As a terrorist organization. And the FBI and other agencies were perfectly right to go after it and dismantle it. But again, you're right. The tragedy is that it discredited self-defense for several generations of Jews and made it almost verboten in the Jewish community. And I still, when I advocate for certain people in the Jewish community, certain writers and activists, Ben Freeman is one of them, and Eve Barlow is another. When I tell people these are the young people you need to go to, I can see in their eyes that they're scared of Kahane. I can see in their eyes that they're scared of the JDL. And I'm just like, guys, this is not the JDL. This is not Meir Kahane. These are just young Jews who are strident in their defense of the Jews and in their defense of Israel. Like, they're not, but this is always in the back of people's minds, especially older Jews who remember the JDL and who were alive when it was very active.
And understand also that he's a symbol of, he became part of, after, sort of, blowing up American Jewish life, he went to Israel, and it became a symbol of an extremism there, which is also still resonating.
Well, what's amazing is that he went even crazier after he went to Israel, which one would have thought was not possible. But he was he was a very complex, had a strange, lived a double life for a while. People, even his supporters, really didn't understand anything about him. But, he did his, he really had an impact, and if some of his ideas, which are still quoted at me by readers at times, that never ends, but, sort of,
he certainly did more harm to the idea
Yeah.
of self-defense than supporting it.
Well, I don't want to get into too great an assessment of Kahane as a personality. I will note, though, that there's a certain double standard, because Kahane didn't say anything Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael didn't say.
For sure.
So in terms of his presence in America, there is a double standard there, where you have a Jewish militant versus black militants, whereas Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael are now revered, and Kahane
especially
is
Malcolm X.
Especially Malcolm X.
Yeah.
Yeah, by the same people. Well, they all advocated violence. They all advocated, some form of ethnic chauvinism. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But I mean, the point, one of the things I make very clear in my book is that what we don't need is another JDL. We don't need illegality. We don't need immorality, especially violations of Jewish morality, because putting aside the moral issue, which is very important, but put it aside for a minute, tactically, it's a disaster, because they'll just crush you. I mean, there's Jews are what, 2% of the U.S. population? Less? I mean, they've got all the guns, as James Baldwin once said. I mean, what do you think's going to happen?
Well,
so
you mentioned guns, so I want to ask about that. Because as you point out in the book, the idea of self-defense is deeply ingrained in American culture. But a lot of that has to do with gun rights, which is something that clearly the overwhelming majority of Jews who are liberal politically oppose. Is that part of the obstacle to getting Jews to think in terms of defending themselves? Obviously, you're talking about something much broader, and you want a nonviolent movement. But the entire idea of self-defense is bound up, with the Second Amendment and what you think about it. And I think a lot of Jews, when you say self-defense, they think you're inviting them to be in a Western, and something that they don't want to go there.
Well, first of all, I want to say, lest I sound too, holier than thou, I want a movement that prefers nonviolence, but is willing to use violence in self-defense when it's legal and when it's moral and when it's necessary. I don't want a movement that simply submits to the abuse of the Jewish body or of Jewish property. But putting that aside, yeah, it's an obstacle, but I have to tell you, the number of Jews who have said to me that they've bought guns over the past 2 years is pretty remarkable, and in some ways, to my mind, ominous, because I'm wondering when and if some of them may use them.
Well, I asked Michael Masters of the Secure Community Network about this very question. Yeah. And he was like, he wasn't down, he was like, people can defend themselves, but he was scared of the idea of a larger number of Jews who really don't know anything about guns suddenly packing heat. Yeah. And like that more harm would come from that than good.
Yeah. And it's not just that. I mean, I wrote on Twitter, actually, a couple of days ago, somewhat controversially, but I said that if you insist on Mamdani, you will get Kahane. And what I meant by that was that, okay, if Mamdani continues to do what he's clearly planning to do, like stuff like the Park East Synagogue siege, a lot of Jews are going to leave New York. But there are going to be those who are going to stay and fight. How are they going to fight? Now, if the Jews are arming up, I mean, we may end up with another JDL. We may end up with another Kahane. And in that case, everybody's in serious trouble. Yeah. And the anti-Semites clearly want a street war. They're clearly going to escalate. They may get one. And I think that bodes ill for everybody involved. I don't have any sympathy for the anti-Semites, but it's not going to be good for New York. And I don't think it's going to be good for the Jews because, again, you're going to have an anti-Semite who in some degree controls the New York Police Department. I mean, this is not going to turn out well. And that worries me more and more. I mean, especially since Park East in the last couple of days, it's begun to seriously worry me. And what's going to happen with that, I don't know. So on some level, it is positive that more and more Jews are buying guns because it shows a willingness to defend themselves. On the other hand, I mean, this is, again, explosive materials, and we need to be very, very careful about it, in my view. Yeah. So those are my thoughts on it. I wish they were more sanguine. But, that's where I'm at right now.
Well, I think you've alluded to this already, but let me ask you explicitly, what is the right model for a Jewish defense group, and how would it operate? And do you see any signs that such a group is anything more than an idea, especially since it's hard to imagine such a group coming into existence without the kind of funding and support that mainstream groups like the ADL, who raise like over $100 million a year, then they aren't doing the job, but which they get.
I think that I do envision ultimately a nationwide organization. And I want it to be one that is centrally controlled, whose leaders are elected by its broader membership, so we can avoid the kind of disconnect that you see in today's American Jewish organizations.
Well, good luck with that, but I think
yeah, right, herding cats, right? And one that is dedicated to self-defense within the law and within Jewish morality. In my book, I present several models of what they might look like. One of them is the SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that helped run the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, which I think is a very good model for a nationwide organization. I point out classic Zionist defense groups like the Haganah in pre-state Palestine, which I like because it had various departments dealing with security on various levels. It had local volunteers to defend Jewish sites. It had the Palmach, which was a kind of informal paramilitary organization to deal with more distant threats. It had an intelligence network that sort of tried to anticipate threats before they happened. And that did their best to operate legally, although there were times when they were oppressed by the British for obvious reasons. But I think, tried to remain within the bounds of legitimacy. And also, this is obviously the most desperate example, but the ZOB, which was the Jewish Defense Organization that fought the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. And what I like about them is their political diversity. They merged all the various political factions of the ghetto, except the very right-wing...
the revisionists who fought separately.
But the revisionists basically joined with
Leon Uris had them joining the ZOB in his novel. That was, which is, I think, the first introduction to the Warsaw Ghetto for many American Jews. And then if they actually read any history, they get disillusioned.
Yeah, but I mean, they were all in the same fight. Let's face it. I mean, So and there will always be dissident groups. You will never get the Jews to agree as a monolith on anything. So there will always be groups that think you're either being too strident or not strident enough, or who have grudges and whatever. But I think that kind of organization would be best. I think it's going to have to be built from the ground up, but via local defense organizations. There is the CSS, the Community Security Service, which is operating nationwide. I think they're a great starting point. The organization that you mentioned, I can't remember.
Secure Community Network.
Yeah, that's also a great starting point. There's a lot of small self-defense organizations like Legion, like Magen Am on the West Coast, and a couple of other groups like that operate within the law and try to teach Jews practical self-defense methods that I think could be built on and unified. There's a group in San Francisco that doesn't even really have a name yet. That seems to be doing good work. And so I think the seeds are there. Yeah, it's going to have to be built from the ground up. And I myself don't really know how to organize these things and fundraise for these things. And I just feel like at the moment, the people who have the will do not have the means, and the people who have the means do not have the will. And one of the things my book wants to do is change that, to give people with the will the means and vice versa, basically.
Yeah, I think you've sort of laid out a model in the book, and we'll hope that perhaps it is put into action at some point in the not too distant future. Well, Benji, thanks so much for joining us today and for discussing your book. Can you tell us how our viewers and listeners can follow your work and where they can get your new book?
Yes, you can follow my work at my Substack, which is called No Delusions, No Despair. It's benjaminkerstein.substack.com. And you can buy my book at Amazon. It's called Self-Defense, A Jewish Manifesto. That's the way to find me. I also have a website, benjaminkerstein.com, which has a link to to where you can buy the book. And those are the major ways to find me.
Well, thanks very much. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to read JNS at jns.org, subscribe to our newsletters, and also to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the audio podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us there, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.